New York City restaurants continue to struggle, some unable to fully recover from COVID restrictions, which forced them to close. In the aftermath of the pandemic, we discussed the new challenges with Andrew Rigie, the executive director of the New York City Hospitality Alliance, an association representing restaurants and nightlife venues throughout the five boroughs.
Welcome to Business Matters, a presentation of the Chamber Coalition, which comprises the New American Chamber of Commerce, the African American International Chamber of Commerce, and the Hispanic American International Chamber of Commerce. To become a chamber member, be a guest, or register for our events, go to www.nacc.nyc. That's www.nacc.nyc, or call us at 718-722-9217. That's 718-722-9217.
A very warm welcome to everyone. We are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Andrew Rigie, who is the Executive Director of the New York Hospitality Alliance. Welcome. So good to have you here with us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So tell us a little bit about your organization. What is it that it does, its mission, etc.?
So the New York City Hospitality Alliance is a not-for-profit association that represents and advocates for restaurants and bars and nightclubs throughout the five boroughs. So we act as their voice in the halls of government, acting to support policies that helps these small businesses reduce regulatory burdens, like streamlining the permitting and licensing process. We do a lot of education and training, for example, compliance with food safety regulations, so restaurants can earn that A letter grade, compliance with the different complex labor laws that govern these cities, hospitality industry. And then we do a lot of different events for the industry as well, panel discussions on hot topics, and also networking events so people can forge bonds and hopefully do business together too.
Okay. So we know that New York City has been known to be the city that never sleeps, and the restaurant industry is such a huge part of that culture that we know of. So we know that also that the restaurant industry has been impacted heavily by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I know we spoke during the pandemic, but moving out of the pandemic 3 years now, how has the COVID-19 impacted the industry? What are some of the latest challenges that you see that the restaurants are facing? Because most of them have gone out of business.
Yeah, it's been such an extraordinarily difficult few years for the city's restaurant industry. You know, we are in obviously such a better place than we were this time of year over the past 3 years, but there's still some real challenges, and we see an uneven recovery. You know, inflation has meant the cost of goods and services have skyrocketed. Labor costs have gone up. So even those restaurants that are fortunate enough to get their business, their sales, their revenue back up to pre-pandemic levels, their margins are even smaller than they were before the pandemic because the cost of operating has gone up. And unfortunately, many of these small business owners still have a lot of pandemic-related debt. They may still owe their landlords a lot of money for missed rent. They may have taken out other types of loans that they're going to be paying off for a long time. So while we're in a much better place than we were, and we should recognize that and be fortunate for that, we also need to recognize that there's still a long road to recovery. And just because we may see a busy restaurant doesn't mean that everything is just fine and perfect yet.
Okay. So you mentioned the challenges that restaurants are facing. Some of them have been lucky enough to stay open. Some of them closed. What are the impediments that you see in that some are having to even stay open or to reopen?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is debt and just the cost of doing business. There's a big challenge. There's a labor shortage in the industry. While we recently, fortunately, have gained back a lot more jobs, we're still about 13,000 fewer jobs in the city's restaurants and bars compared to, January or February of 2020, right before the pandemic shut our industry down. So most restaurants are operating short-staffed. A lot of people have left the industry with experience, so they may not be coming back. So it's getting new people, training people, getting them to understand how to work in a restaurant and familiarize themselves. So those are some of the challenges. Inflation has also made it difficult for the everyday consumer because it costs a lot more money to go out and spend money on meals or at local bars. So that has been a challenge as well. And then the overall regulatory environment. There's a lot of complex issues. If someone wants to open up a new restaurant, it can take a very, very long time to get a liquor license, for example. And a liquor license is often required when people want to open up a new restaurant and go out to dine. They want to have a beer, glass of wine, a cocktail. And because it can be very delayed to get one of these licenses, a restaurant could be ready to open up, but they can't open until they get the liquor license. So they could start burning through a lot of the opening capital that they had. And it can be difficult to keep your initial employees if you're not open. So there's still some real challenges. It impacts a lot of restaurants in the same way, but then there's definitely specific, unique ways certain businesses are being impacted. One example would be if you're located in Midtown or Lower Manhattan, for example, and you rely heavily on office workers, but people are still working remote, you still don't have as many customers in the area than you used to. And who knows if they're ever going to come back to the office 5 days a week? Probably not. So especially like Monday and Fridays tend to be a lot slower for those businesses that are located in what has been a historical commercial business district of the city.
Okay, so do you think that's an issue that's specific to the city, Manhattan?
So that certainly is an issue that's big for Manhattan, particularly Midtown and Lower Manhattan. There are business commercial districts, in other areas of the city, but not to say they're not impacted, but I think that challenge is most present in Manhattan's core commercial districts. And it may be to the benefit of some restaurants in more residential areas, because if people aren't going into Midtown to go to the office, they may be at a restaurant in the morning or afternoon in the neighborhood where they live because they're working remotely. But I also think when people are working at home, they tend to make more of their meals at home than say they would if they were going into an office somewhere. So, it's all different. Different neighborhoods are going to certainly have their different challenges, as are different types of restaurants in different places. But like I said, much better place than we were. Still some real underlying challenges that need to be addressed. So we need to continue to go out and support our restaurants, dine out as much as you can afford it. Because it's not just for the business owners, but it's for the workers. It's for all the people that sell products and services to local restaurants that rely on a vibrant restaurant industry for their livelihood, whether it's the farmer upstate or the truck driver that's bringing the goods to the restaurant or the plumber who comes to fix something. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So we
It's a
rely
domino
on.
effect.
Exactly.
So just to touch a little bit, continuing on the remote work, we know that recently Mayor Eric Adams announced a pilot initiative for city workers. Well, how do you think that's going to affect the industry?
Well, we'll see. I've been hesitant to make any long-term predictions because although we are in a much better place than we were even last year at this time, COVID was such a shock to the system. It was an unprecedented crisis that changed things. And I think as time goes on, we have to see how things normalize. I remember when COVID first hit, and then in August, remember, we thought everyone was going to be going back to the office in September, and then the city had a big fireworks celebration that COVID was over, and then the Delta variant hit and wiped everything else out again. And then we were in a much better place, and the borders opened up, and international tourists from around the world were going to come back, during the holidays, people book their holiday dinners with their families and friends and offices at local restaurants and bars, and people book plane tickets to come to New York City for the holiday season. And then what happened? Omicron variant,
Omicron.
boom, it wiped everything out again. So what I've been saying that is accurate, I believe, is the only thing that's been certain throughout the pandemic is everything is uncertain. And I think things will, over time, within the next couple of years, stabilize a bit more, and we'll have a better idea of what things are going to look at. But I do think remote work is going to be here. It's not going anywhere. And I think we as a city just need to adjust. And it's going to maybe benefit a restaurant in a neighborhood where more people are during the day because they're working remote, and hurt a business that was located in a commercial district that relied on more office workers. But I think it's up to New Yorkers and policymakers to come up with ways to get more people into the office buildings to fill them up, maybe turn them into residential units in certain cases. So it's a big, complex situation that we have going on. But at the end of the day, I think people love food and restaurants. They connect to food and the culture of connecting over food in restaurants. These are our social spaces. So I think in order for New York City to recover, our restaurants throughout the 5 boroughs really need to be at the core of the recovery. And that's just going to take time. But, people are very connected and support the industry.
And that actually leads me to my next question, because I'm thinking that because the restaurant industry is such a vital part of what makes New York, New York, and, New York to me cannot fully recover without the industry recovering. What can the Adams administration do to ensure that, they get on that path to recovery?
So there's a lot of things they've started to do, and they need to continue and quadruple down on. They need to continue to streamline the permanent licensing process so new small businesses can get open faster, they can expand quicker. They need to focus on more education, training, and compliance first, instead of just issuing violations for minor infractions and violations. And they're doing that, but there's a lot more still to be done. I think they need to invest in bringing tourists and local people from the tri-state area to New York to see a Broadway show, to go to a restaurant, to go to all different neighborhoods throughout the 5 boroughs and experience the different food, the culture, the museums, and everything that these different neighborhoods have to offer. I think they need to also just instill confidence. They need to keep people safe. People need to feel safe. I think we need to keep the city clean. I think they need to really formalize the permanent outdoor dining program, because restaurants are still operating under the emergency program, and they don't know always what they can do, what they can't do, and they want to invest and upgrade their outdoor dining, but they're hesitant to do so because they don't want to spend money on doing something really nice, only be told a couple months later, oh, all the rules have changed. Now you got to take that down and do something different. So there's not one situation or one policy that's going to fix everything. It's going to be a complex recipe and a big menu of a lot of different policy agenda items being implemented for a full recovery, combined with time and support from people in the industry and people that really want to support their local restaurants and other small businesses.
Talking about support, you mentioned operating costs, and one of the highest costs in having a restaurant is the rent. And we saw, all throughout the pandemic, rent for residents. But do you think there should be some sort of initiative for rent between landlords and the restaurant owners, the tenants?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really big challenge. During the pandemic, we got a few important bills passed, one of which has now expired, but it saved so many restaurants, was suspending personal guarantees in leases. So landlords couldn't go after the personal assets of small business owners that had a personal guarantee in their lease. I think we still need to look at different types of rent support, particularly for those businesses that need it. In addition to the rent, one of the things that doesn't always get discussed are the property taxes. In most small business leases, not only do the business owners pay the rent, but they also pay the proportional part of the landlord's real estate taxes. And those have really gone up in most places over the years. So that's like paying rent on top of your rent. So I think there's other ways that government could try to, reduce some of those taxes as well, support particularly smaller businesses, which the city has been doing in like lease negotiations, making sure that they have a good lawyer and they understand what they're committing to in their leases. So there's certainly, things that can be done, but it's tough. Just the price of real estate, whether it's commercial or residential, is sky high in New York City, and it poses a big challenge.
So one of the things that came out of the pandemic for the restaurant industry was the outdoor dining. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so outdoor dining saved thousands of restaurants from permanently closing. The city credited it with saving about 100,000 jobs. And if you go to neighborhoods throughout the city, people love dining al fresco. What we had before the pandemic with sidewalk cafes were about 1,400 licensed sidewalk cafes, primarily located south of 96th Street in Manhattan. That's because it was cost prohibitive and there was too much red tape and bureaucracy for a lot of smaller businesses, particularly outside of Manhattan or in Upper Manhattan, to have them. And many neighborhoods were actually restricted altogether from having them, even if they wanted to go through the red tape bureaucracy and pay for it. So what we've been calling on the city to do is create a permanent outdoor dining program that allows more businesses to participate, cuts the red tape, keeps the fees down so it's inclusive, it's not cost prohibitive, and addresses some of the issues that not only restaurants but residents have. There's some great outdoor dining, but there's some also roadway dining that needs to be torn down. It's abandoned, it's not being used. We need to upgrade the standards to address things like storm drain water getting by the roadway so it can get into the storm drains, make sure that it's mitigated for vermin or, and stuff like that. So a lot of the concerns or challenges that have resulted from outdoor dining, I think, can be done by creating a more standardized and sustainable system. Don't forget, this was put up in response to an unprecedented crisis, an emergency. Restaurants had no money. The guidance was always changing. Things were open, then they were shut. You could do this, then you couldn't do that. People weren't clear. They didn't have money to invest. So I think we can't look at this model as what the permanent program should look like, but we should use the concept that this program, outdoor dining, has helped thousands of restaurants, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and people love dining outdoors, and it was equitable and brought outdoor dining to neighborhoods that were never really eligible to have it or couldn't afford it. And I think as we rebuild, we heard a lot about this, how do we rebuild a more fair, a more equitable city? And I think that means, having a good program that's accessible.
And we shouldn't call them COVID cabins either.
Not at all. I call them streeteries, dining cabanas. I don't like the word people say sheds. I'm like, if you have a backyard and you put a rake and a shovel in it, it's a shed. But this is where people are eating. I also think, most restaurants under the permanent program will just have sidewalk cafes. They may not have enough business to have an indoor dining, sidewalk cafe, and the roadway. People did both because they couldn't have any indoor dining, and then it was severely limited. So only the restaurants, I think, that are really busy that can justify the cost and the operational challenge of having sidewalks and roadway will have both. And then some restaurants who may not be able to have sidewalk cafes because the sidewalk is too narrow, maybe they're going to opt to have only the roadway dining. So we'll see. I think it's going to take some time to shake out, but we really need the permanent guidelines so people know what to do and they can apply and transfer into a permanent program and get rid of all the old stuff.
Exactly. And what about the delivery apps, the fees? That's been a significant challenge as well.
Yeah, many of these big third-party delivery companies have a long history of exploiting local restaurants, charging them fees for services they didn't provide, creating fake websites and phone numbers for them so they could take restaurants' own customers and charge them more fees. So a fee cap and some other regulations were put into place. Now the third-party delivery companies have a very sophisticated, aggressive campaign to gut the fee cap so they can start charging small restaurants bigger fees under the guise that they're really there to help small businesses. I don't buy it. They have a long history that has taught us not to trust them. So I think we need to have some real conversations about how can we ensure that small businesses, local restaurants can really get good delivery business, promote themselves, but not be subject to some of the unfair business practices that these huge billion-dollar corporations have shown us to implement over the years when they're not regulated.
Okay, so as the executive director of the New York Hospitality Alliance, what do you envision for the industry moving forward?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the best thing we could have moving forward is get to a place where there's always going to be challenges, but people feel good about being in the industry. They don't feel that government's always out to get them with this fine and that violation or some complicated law that's basically just going to catch them when they're really trying to do the best thing. And I hope people are able to get past the impact of the pandemic by getting rid of that related debt that they have, staffing up to levels like they were before, and really creating a more inclusive industry. We're so diverse. We have people that work in restaurants and own restaurants from all walks of life. So I want to really be able to provide them the most opportunity to grow and succeed as possible. But I think the biggest thing we could have right now is get back to a place where the focus is not on how are we going to survive as a result of the pandemic. Let's deal with new challenges and move on from the pandemic challenges.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to share a secret with me. I see you very active on social media and you are at so many different restaurants, which I guess, it's part of your job. How do you stay so slim?
So I used to run. I have to say, the honest answer is, I think it's just genetics. I think I think I'm just
don't blame
and I
you,
stay
it's just
busy.
genetics. Don't
Just
hate.
genetics. I have no secret, man. But what I do is I walk everywhere. I constantly am walking as much as I possibly can. And I think it's good for the body, burns some calories, good for the mind and soul, and lets you see what's happening in the city. Lets you see people, see the new restaurants, talk to people. And I think, if you eat a lot and you're not active, that's a problem. But if you eat a lot and you are active, less of a problem.
All right. So thank you so much, Mr. Rigie. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome.
Welcome to Business Matters, a presentation of the Chamber Coalition, which comprises the New American Chamber of Commerce, the African American International Chamber of Commerce, and the Hispanic American International Chamber of Commerce. To become a chamber member, be a guest, or register for our events, go to www.nacc.nyc. That's www.nacc.nyc, or call us at 718-722-9217. That's 718-722-9217.